Hello. Today on the 01581, we have our regularly recurring guest, Kristi Williams, our town manager, and our featured guest will talk about the importance of history and his quest to correct it. Kristi, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome
Happy
back.
to be back.
Second show, we'll start like doing hash marks for
Right.
how many, right? Right. So you're here to give us an update. We had a long, but I think really efficient and effective town meeting, 39 articles in like one day
Yeah.
and less than 12 hours,
Yeah.
which I think is a record. I don't know who keeps those, but.
Yeah, I don't know.
But yeah, so a recap and whatever other
Sure.
updates, please, thanks.
Yeah, I think we just really want to thank everybody who came out to town meeting to participate, and I think support most of the articles. All but two of the articles passed. One of them that didn't pass was the changing of the time of October town meeting. So I know that's something that the select board had put on the warrant, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at a future meeting.
Absolutely, yeah. No, we got some good feedback from. I know we had received a few emails before the meeting, and certainly on town meeting floor there were some ideas shared. So I think it's certainly good for me as a select board member. It's good to sort of reflect on those and think about kind of our diversity statements and how are we approaching those. So the voters decided, and we'll go back and do some work on that.
That's right. But everything else did pass. So, everything that's a raise and appropriate, like the budget, obviously starts July 1st, but anything that's a free cash article is something we can move forward with more quickly.
Great.
So we're really excited to get, I mentioned on your show last time, that town website upgrade project moving forward.
Yeah.
So I know our IT director's already been in my office
Awesome.
ready to get
Show me the
started,
cash.
get going. So we're really excited about that. And then all of the capital needs that were funded through free cash, folks can start ordering.
Yeah.
And then there's all the bylaw changes. So
Sure.
those have to go to the Attorney General for approval. But there were, I think, 2 to the general bylaws, and then
Of
the
course.
zoning bylaws.
A lot.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah.
And I want to commend the planning board for going through those in a really efficient way. That could have been a very, very protracted discussion. Yeah. I think it was efficient. People asked questions where it was appropriate. I think it's important that I'm not sure the public always understands that about the procurement and the need to have the authorization to spend money or borrow money. Can you just talk about that a little bit? The timing of that?
Yeah, sure. So town meeting is the body that authorizes appropriation. So anytime we need funding, we have to ask town meeting for permission.
Right.
And that's what we do through the articles and then also through the budget. So
if we Chris wants a dump truck for DPW, right? I believe that may have been one of the items. He had a number of them. He can't just even go and pre-order or start that work, right?
Right. So we couldn't sign any sort of contract to purchase
Right.
without having the funding available, which happens at town meeting.
Right.
So some of our larger items, most of our larger items go through the capital planning process.
Right.
So people will go through, they'll get a quote.
Right.
They'll go to talk to capital planning about it. Ultimately, nothing can be ordered without going through procurement laws. So we have to go out to bid sometimes, depending on the cost of the project.
Sure.
Or we're a member of several purchasing groups, which have done that sort of pre-work for us.
Yeah.
So we're able to take advantage of those prices.
Sure. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
So the 2 articles that did not pass. One was the change in special town meeting timing, and then the other was the citizens petition, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that was a non-binding citizens petition to repeal basically the climate action plan.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, okay. And we some of the other articles that were, I think just the public certainly will be interested in, we talked here on the 01581 about the stormwater utility, and so that did pass, and again, that is not, it's not started, you're not going to see a bill, it's really just creation of the bylaw, and then now I feel like the next phase of the hard work begins.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
So there was some funding following the approval of that article to get started on doing that evaluation and process, and then a lot of work to be done through the select board. But
Sure.
I think the board's fully interested in people being part of that conversation.
Sure. I think we also saw some capital expenditures in the schools and some repairs, some roof repairs. I think people are astounded at the cost of what it takes just to get design costs and in municipal work, and really I think that the presenters, sponsors of the different articles did a great job of explaining why we have an OPM and the process that we have to go through, and the process that the capital expenditure and the select board, I think, also have, and finance committee have said, you've got to bring information, in advance and do a lot of your due diligence versus a not to exceed kind of approach.
Right. So the design helps us get to the actual cost.
Right.
And that's what town meeting has asked us to come with. So
Right.
not a rough order of magnitude, but actual cost. And for that, it takes a lot of work to develop that. So there's some pre-funding that has to happen.
And there's some risk in doing that, right? You can do all this design work. We could spend, easily a couple $100,000 on a design, depending upon the size of the project, and then determine that, it's too much, it's not the right time, or what have you. And so that, while we've made the investment and we have the design plans, they sit on a shelf, and so, they have to be addressed later.
Hopefully not, but yeah.
Yeah, hopefully not. I mean, hopefully there's a sense of, and I think that's sometimes, I think maybe folks don't understand sort of, I don't want to say behind the scenes because all the meetings are public, but there's a lot of work to determine, on the staff side, right? Like, what's the right time to bring this forward? And then there's sort of the public will of it, the political side of it of, is this the right time?
Yeah. I mean, we have the master plan, strategic plan, climate action plan, so we're following all of those. But we also have all of our current infrastructure that we have to care for. So it's really balancing all of those things.
So one of the big elements of the budget was that we've settled several contracts, both on school side and the town side. So that was a big component of the budget. And what we'll see is a component of increase. But town government is service, right? I mean, yes, we have trucks and, equipment and all of that, but it really is, it's the people that deliver the service.
Right, yeah, no, and our unions have been great in terms of working with us and, understanding where we're at, and so we're really happy to have been able to settle those. Yeah,
no, I think really having been on the side of some of those negotiations, I think there's a great relationship, there's an establishment of professionalism and real give and take, so that's great. What else?
I think the only other thing I had to share with you today is we just talked about amendments to bylaws. We at our October town meeting, we had an amendment to the plastic bag reduction bylaw, and now formerly known as the plastic bag reduction bylaw.
I was going to say.
So now it's the plastic reduction bylaw.
Right.
That was approved by the Attorney General, and the way that the bylaw is written is it goes into effect 6 months following the town meeting. So April 17th will go into effect the amended plastic reduction bylaw, and that's really about the reduction of single-use plastics. So specifically impacting restaurants, grocery stores, people who have dine-out services.
Sure. And I know that that was it was a confusing bylaw change. What are we actually changing? It was there was a pre-existing bylaw that reduced single-use or plastic bags. Right. This is now all plastics that we're trying to minimize. I don't know that we'll ever reduce them, but we can certainly. And so if this will primarily affect retail, right, or restaurants,
That's right.
But it will in some ways, I guess, affect consumers in that they're receiving those goods. Is there anything else that consumers particularly should be aware of?
I think that we're working with these establishments to really put this into place. I know that our Board of Health has been working with them, our Economic Development Committee. We're sending out a reminder this week. And
Great.
So, I think that, we want to hear if people are not abiding by the bylaw, but we also want to work with these establishments because this is really new. So.
And there's also a drawdown time, right, of supplies. So while the bylaw, correct me if I'm wrong, if is going into effect on the 17th, if they have stock that presumably that of let's say plastic containers, presumably there's been a conversation with that owner and the Board of Health saying, look, I got to use this up, but I recognize it might not be like no plastic on April 17th. Is that fair to say, or?
So actually, because the select board is the enforcement authority.
Yeah.
They have the opportunity to come to the select board to ask for that waiver for those reasons.
Okay.
So I think we might see some folks come to your first April meeting and ask for that waiver.
Sure.
For the delay, so that they can use those down. But I think that was also the purpose of that 6-month period.
They know it's coming.
Process.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And inevitably, it's and I think from the public's view, look, if you go to some place and it's April 18th and you get a plastic container, I would say personally, make a note of it. You know, maybe if you frequent there often, you have a nice conversation with someone saying, hey, just not sure if you're aware, and the town is there to help. So the Board of Health is there to help, and certainly the Select Board is, but let's be kind to each other,
I also think, I myself have been surprised at how, I guess, unrecognizable these biodegradable
Great
containers
point.
are.
Yep.
A lot of them do look like
Plastic.
And
Quote,
so,
plastic, right.
It's a good question to ask before you get concerned, because I do think that
Right.
it looks like,
Right.
I guess, the real thing.
Sure.
It looks like a plastic container, but might not be. So.
Sure. I remember when the proponent of this bylaw change came forward and had a whole, all these examples, and I was like, what? Those look like plastic, right? So you really have to understand that. Great. Okay, super. Okay. Well, thank you, and we'll see you next time on the show.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks.
Hello and welcome back to the 01581. For this portion of the show, I'm joined by a great guest, David Nourse. And David's going to talk about a project that he undertook to correct some history here in Westborough regarding a very important event in 1776. David, welcome.
Shelby, thank you. I'm David Nourse. I reside at 80 Nurse Street, as I'm supposed to say at town meeting.
Right, very good. Now that everyone knows where David lives.
Right.
David, tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection here to Westborough, because certainly the Nourse name is well known. But
I'm a retired lawyer. I grew up here in town. I was in the class of Westborough High School, 1954. Charlotte Spinney, best known for that class. And after Westborough High School in 1954, I went off to college, on to the Navy after that for 3 years, then to law school in New York, and then I practiced law in New York for about 45 years. I came back to Westborough in 2010, so I've been gone a long time. Yeah. And Westborough changed a lot in the time that I've been away. But during the time I was away, a monument was erected in Minuteman Park in 1975. By the Westborough Bicentennial Commission.
okay,
And my father had given me a copy of Chris Allen's book, the On the Beaten Path, History of Westborough. And in that book is a very nice photograph of the monument in Minuteman Park, which I looked at. And I looked for a name on that monument, which was the name of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Daniel Nourse, spelled N-U-R-S-E at that time, who we knew from family history had been involved in the Revolutionary War. And Daniel's not on the plaque. And I wondered about that, and I said to myself, well, I wonder if our family history of all this time has been wrong.
Sure.
We thought he was involved, and he's not listed on the monument, however, so maybe we were wrong. And so it wasn't until after a little time that a nephew of mine, Alex Gross, who was at Hamilton College doing research there, found something that was called Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolutionary War. Now, this is an 18-volume work that was done starting in about 1896, and it was published over that from 1896 to about 1908 at the direction of the General Court of Massachusetts. And they wanted to make sure that the documents that were in the archives had information which was in fact put into print. All of those archives, of course, were mostly handwritten documents.
Sure.
And so what happened is that as a result of this direction of the General Court to create this work, this listing of the soldiers and sailors of the Revolutionary War. They worked out card files, and they had all these card files, one card for each man, and what
Wow.
his service was. It must have been an immense
Yeah,
job.
I can't imagine.
And it took years to do it, but there it was. When you looked at, I forget what volume it was, of Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors, there's Daniel Nourse. And
Okay.
he had served at the time of the April 19th, 1775 alarm, Lexington alarm as it was called. And he had served at Saratoga, and he had served as a guard of the Convention Army. Those were the people who had surrendered at Saratoga. And so he clearly had been involved, and yet he had not made it to the monument in Minuteman Park. And I didn't really think what to do about that for quite a long time. But it occurred to me that at some point that maybe I could find out who were the other people that had been involved with Daniel in this event.
Sure.
And Massachusetts Historical Society was very helpful in that respect. Dan Hinchin, the reference librarian down there, put me on to, in fact, first of all, he gave me a list of the people in that company that my ancestor had marched in. It was a company in which Seth Morse had been the captain. And then he gave me reference to a book which was produced back in, a little book, produced back in 1976 by Charles Hambrick Stowe and Donna Smirlis, called Massachusetts Militia Companies and Offices in the Lexington Alarm. And they had gone through the archives, and they had made lists of all those who were the officers in the companies that had responded to the Lexington Alarm. And they had some fascinating information about the alarm. I mean, we all know a little bit about what happened.
Sure.
We know that Paul Revere made a ride, and he spread the word from town to town, and the embattled farmers gathered, and the flag was flying over the bridge. We know all that, but we don't know, or at least I didn't know certainly,
Sure.
that 3,500 people had shown up to be involved in the fighting that drove the British back to Boston. But 20,000 had shown up to really keep Boston as a little blockaded island. They got to Cambridge, they got to Roxbury, and they effectively kept the British in Boston. They came out at Bunker Hill, were bloodied there in the battle at Bunker Hill. And then they didn't come out again until they sailed away to Canada in March of 1776.
Yeah.
That's a date still celebrated in Boston as Evacuation Day. So I came to realize that the April 19th event really was an extraordinary event. You got 20,000 people marshaling to respond to an attack on the towns of Lexington and Concord. And it had the effect, first of all, of course, it started the war, the Revolutionary War. But it had the effect also tactically of keeping the British in Boston for a long period of time until they sailed away.
Sure.
So it seemed to me that was an event that was worth publicizing. And basically I was able through Mr. Hinchin at Massachusetts Historical Society, and then in the archives, Massachusetts Archives, John Hannigan, head of reference services, I was able to get the muster rolls that were submitted for those folks who had marched on April 19th. And it turned out that the legislature in Massachusetts in November of 1775 had decided that all those who had participated in the Lexington Alarm should get paid. And so they set out a list of requirements as to how that was to be done. And it involved the company commanders working out a list of those who had been in their companies who had served. And that list was to be set out in a certain format, showing the miles that had been marched, and the days of service, and the rates of pay for each of those men, and the total amount that was due to them. Now, so these muster rolls were then to be copied and verified before a notary public, submitted to the commission for verification, and then the men were paid on that basis. So it was really an elaborate process, and the muster rolls that we received from the archives showing these events were really quite extraordinary. Now they're all over, you can see them yourself. You can look online now in the Westborough archives, and there's a record there with respect to the monument that we're talking about. And in that archive, you can find these muster rolls, and you can see for yourself. These folks are being paid at the rate of 1 pence per mile, a penny per mile, and their rates of pay had been set in November of 1774. The numbers are all set out on the rolls, and so they're really quite interesting documents.
So, and how much did your great-great-great
Well, I
grandfather?
forgot the number. I'm
Somewhere in the, I think
we
we
got
talked
5
about
shillings for
shillings.
marching the 60 miles. It was
60.
30 miles down and 30 miles back, and so he got a penny a mile for that.
Wow.
And that turned out to be 5 shillings.
Wow.
And then he was being paid at the rate of £2 per lunar month, so he got pay for half of a lunar month, I think.
Wow.
So not a lot of money.
Yeah, and one of the things when we were preparing for the show that struck me is that, you know, you talked about the importance of the militia being almost like the first community organization. That was an interesting
The militia
comment.
is kind of a fascinating thing. I think it's fair to call them the first community service organization.
Yeah.
Because in Massachusetts at that time, you didn't have much. You had the town, and you had some officials. You had the church, of course, and then you had the militia.
Right.
And those are the 3 groups.
Right.
And every man belonged to the militia, 16 years or over. There originally were 2 groups. There was an alarm list, it was called, an alarm list. And that had the ministers and all those who were really in pretty poor shape. They were to be brought out only if it was all stocked out.
Worst case.
But everyone else is in the militia.
Yep.
And in December, or in the latter part of 1774, as tensions with the British were building up, it was decided that it would be nice to take out of that militia group those who were a little younger and more adept, perhaps, and make them Minutemen. The concept of a Minuteman had been around for a long time, but it wasn't until the end of 1774 that there were actually Minuteman companies that were formed. And Westborough had a Minuteman company. It was had been organized. There was always a question as to Minutemen, as to whether they were special. How special were they?
Right.
And the Minutemen thought they were special, of course. And so they petitioned the town on a number of occasions at the end of 1774 and early 1775 to be paid more. They were special, they ought to be paid more.
Right.
And the town pretty much ignored that. The idea, and this is set out in a history book somewhere, was that they were all to be Minutemen. They were all to be special. And so there wasn't any discrimination between the members of the militia that some were better than others. They all got the same rates of pay, and they were all expected to do the same. And they were expected to respond on a minute's notice.
Right. And when we talk about, you started to touch on it, sort of the magnitude of the impact of this alarm on Westborough. Right. So so you took this research, and then we were talking, again, as we were preparing there were about 215 men and boys
Right.
over the age of 16, and that record is available in Town Hall, right?
You can see it down there in the bottom. There's a nice enlarged photograph of it.
Yeah.
It's hard to read, but the math is there. You can count up the names, and there were 215 names. It started off with the Reverend Ebenezer Parkman.
Right.
He's the first name on the list. Of course, he's in the alarm list. He's the guy who's not supposed to show up until it really is dangerous.
Right.
And there were some old men on there. William Nourse, who was the founder of Nourse Farm, was born in 1696.
Wow.
And so he was 81 years old at the time.
And he's on the list.
He's on the list.
Wow.
Well, so how valid is that list? But anyways, 215 names on the list. If you take 101 men in Westborough who responded to the alarm, that's 46 men on the Minuteman list, and then 55 of the Minutemen, 101 men in all.
Right.
That's 47% of those men on the list.
And again, these are indivials whose names are on these muster rolls.
They're all there. And again, you can look at them in on the town archive.
So they've responded, and then so they've responded. They're responding to this alarm, and then they're serving. And help me to understand though where does the discrepancy come in? So.
Well, the problem was, I think, and as it worked out, Chris Allen, for example, very helpful in trying to sort this out. Chris Allen had been on the commission, but she'd been in charge of the parade, not this part of it. But she said that the Bicentennial Commission had relied very heavily upon an old history of Westborough, and it was a history that, and I've got a very beaten-up copy of it.
I was going to say that's an old book.
It's Reverend DeForest, who is the congregational minister here in town, had written a history of Westborough. And the town decided in 1891 that they would publish this history of Westborough. And so that's what the Bicentennial Commission had looked at.
Okay.
And in that book, there is the reference to a company, a muster roll of a company of Minutemen. and there's no reference to anyone else.
Sure.
And so the Bicentennial Commission relied on the history. That was what was there. That's
Right.
what they knew.
Right.
And they took that list, which actually turned out to be a training list of men, and they were told that this company, that this roll was the same in all respects as those who had marched, except that William Woods had marched at the time of the alarm. The muster roll that was referred to was actually a training roll. We've got it over in the in fact, you can see it in the archives. It was done in November. It was to get paid for training that the Minutemen had put in.
Sure.
And on that Minuteman payment, the roll for payment is listed a fellow who got paid but didn't show up at the time of the April 19th alarm. And so the existing monument was honoring a no-show in a sense. And I thought that was wrong, and there were other problems with that record.
Well, there were some also spelling.
Well, yeah, they had
and again,
they got the name of the captain wrong. He was an Edmund Brigham, but they made it Edward.
Right.
They had changed it, and now and that was something that the Bicentennial Commission had done on its own.
Right.
So along the service, we had a monument which was flawed, and I had to argue that because it was flawed and because you couldn't correct it. The only real approach to rectifying the matter and to honoring all those who had participated was to set up a new monument. Sure. And so finally that got through.
And I remember being part of those as
you were
chair
in one of these meetings, yes.
Yeah, as chair of the select board, that person is a representative to the trustees, and it was a very to your point, I love how you said that there is a fondness for history and monuments that have been created, but I think that what came out of it was an understanding of there is something here. There's a discrepancy, and so what I think Westborough should be proud that there was healthy debate. Felt like a little bit of a setback. I know you and I had talked about that at the time, but then that led to the trustees actually authorizing a small amount of funding to do some additional research, which
Right.
I think you found
that was a good
helpful.
thing. That was a good thing. I mean, I was the only guy standing up to say this is what we should do, and so peer review by two historians really was a very helpful part of this process. And J.L. Bell was one of the historians, and Alexander Kane was the other. And their reports were issued in February of 2022 and March of 2022. So they said, well, this is the same. It is verified. Of course, it was verified by the commanding officers of the companies, but again, it was verified also by the publication of the 18 volumes of Soldiers and Sailors.
Sure.
So now we had two historians who also said, well, this is okay. And in fact, the J.L. Bell was very helpful in the sense that he pointed out a problem that we had with one of the muster rolls. That muster roll, this is the Baker roll, it had shown the George Baker as the captain, but the roll was verified not by George Baker, but by Joseph Baker.
Interesting.
And and as Bell pointed out, militia captains were by and large people of the community who were well known. And there wasn't any record of a George Baker, but Joseph Baker was a well-known person in town. And so we decided that, yes, Joseph Baker was a captain. It was a typographical error that had gotten into the muster roll.
Sure.
But it was Joseph who verified it, and Joseph was the living guy. This George Baker, we couldn't find any trace of. So that's the change we made. So it's the Joseph Baker as captain of the 2nd Militia Company.
So this peer review was done. It was presented back to the trustees. I know there were subsequent meetings, and there was the discussion about what information do you put on this. So there was acceptance basically of this updated history, and I think it's important for our viewers and listeners to understand. I mean, to me, this is a great example of there was never a suggestion by you or anyone to remove the existing Minuteman Park. I think it serves a monument.
It
has to stay, right? It was done. It was commissioned. It was an important time in Westborough's history as the bicentennial, but we have an opportunity to correct history and reflect it accurately. So anyways, so the trustees, they say, great, go ahead. But then there was still a little bit of debate as to what do you put on it, right?
Right. Well, the test was, there was a thought that maybe this should be a Revolutionary War monument.
Right.
And I think the trustees have been looking to have a Revolutionary War monument for
Yes,
some time.
they had.
And they saw this as an opportunity to achieve that goal. But I argued it really wasn't a Revolutionary War monument that we're talking about. It was a monument to a specific occasion, the Lexington alarm of April 19. That was not a war. That was the start of a war.
Right.
It was an important thing. It was an extraordinary thing in the sense of those who responded to it and what it accomplished. But it wasn't a war memorial per se.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, to title it Westborough's Response
Yep.
seemed to be a better approach. This is what happened. This is what Westborough did
Yeah.
with respect to this particular event.
Yep.
And so that's what was finally decided. I went ahead with to try to get a plaque, and expose, science and graphics was helpful on that. We worked out the text. We had a lot more names, of course.
It's big.
Yeah, this is now it's 32 by 32.
Right.
And the question was, well, are the names the same size as they were on the other monument?
Right, right.
Well, they're pretty much the same size.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you had a 32 by 32
What do you put it
plaque.
on?
How do you mount it?
Right.
So we had to look for a boulder. And here, the Derek Sowery of the DPW is very helpful in trying to find a boulder for me.
Yep.
DPW keeps track of such things, but they couldn't find.
Who knew, right?
They couldn't find a boulder of the right size, and so I found one. It was up in our pasture. It had been dug out at some point in time, and it was in a wall. And I got my backhoe to pull it out of the wall. It was so big I couldn't move it very far, but I could get it out so we could look at it.
Yeah.
And it had a nice flat surface on it.
Wow.
You could measure it out, and there was room for a 32 by 32
Wow.
plaque.
What
So-
were the chances, right?
Well, no, I think there are lots of boulders. We have lots of boulders, and so there might have been others. But this was not a pretty boulder like the existing one in the park, but it's got character.
Yeah.
And it's got the right kind of surface, and it holds this plaque very nicely,
Sure.
I think. So there we were. We had a.
So you have the plaque design, you got the boulder.
Had to move it. How are we going to get this thing out of our pasture?
Yeah.
And again, Derek Sowery, very helpful in getting the DPW guys with their big equipment to come in and move this
That's
thing.
great. That's great.
So the long and short of it is, in November last year,
Yep.
they finally got the plaque. They got the boulder set up in the park.
Yep.
Got the plaque installed on it, but it was right before Veterans Day, and so
Right.
it wasn't an appropriate time to dedicate it. So the boulder,
So you had to wait
and the plaque
again.
have been sitting there since November, but now we have to dedicate them.
Right.
And the plan is to dedicate them on April 15.
Of this year.
This year. That's
Yep.
coming up.
Yep.
And we have a pretty good program. I have not been able to arrange for the F-16 fighter jets to fly over.
Well.
That of course really marks the ceremony, but it'll be good. It'll be.
You know what?
it'll be
Westborough
worth
TV
watching.
has a drone, so maybe
No,
that
no
can
drones.
substitute.
No, but anyways, April 15 in Minuteman Park. It's going to start at 10 o'clock,
Okay.
and we have some dignitaries there, and we have some choral group that'll sing,
Great.
and we have some other folks. So, anyways, it's a good thing, and I hope people will come.
Yeah.
We're trying to honor people who responded to an event, which was an extraordinary event, as it turned out. It's a historical event. We know some of these people because their names are on the streets here in town. We have
What are some of the names?
Oh, a lot of them. There's a nursery, but that's another matter.
Yeah.
You can go down the list and you can find a lot of these names. But so we know them from their names on the streets. But now you can know them because they were involved in this
Right,
event.
right.
They marched on April 19th, and we honor them because they marched.
Yeah.
And this monument's designed to remember them and to honor them.
Absolutely. So we'll make sure that we'll have the information on a slide at the end of the show
Okay.
for announcing the time and location.
10 o'clock on Saturday, April 15th.
There we go. And now we have the verbal overview. I love it. This is fascinating. I think it's a great example of truly like human pursuit of the truth. And I love that your curiosity, going way back to 2010, brought this forward.
It nagged at me.
Yeah, no, and it's really been an interesting kind of private-public partnership to bring this forward. So this
Thanks.
is great. David, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank
This
you.
is great. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the 01581, and we'll see you next time on the show. Thanks.